In this video, we'll talk about the major drawbacks of gross domestic product, GDP. So the first drawback is GDP is a measure of productivity, not welfare. So it measures how much production of goods and services we produce every year, but it doesn't tell you what is the standard of living of the population, what is the quality of life. Let's get an example. Germany during World War II. What happened to their GDP? Did they have a high or low GDP? They had a very high GDP. Why? Because they utilized all the resources for military weapons. Therefore, what happened to the welfare? The quality of life, the standard of living, it dropped because all the resources was devoted for the war, for military production. Therefore, if we look at a man, what would be the meal for a man? It will be 4 pieces of sugar and 3/4 of a bread. For ladies, kids, and elder people, they will get less meal. Therefore, sometimes we could have a very high GDP, but the quality of life is low. Therefore, we could say that GDP is a measure of productivity, but it's not a measure of welfare or quality of life, such as pollution. Some countries that produce a lot, this comes at the expense of pollution. They make a lot of pollution. Also, it affects the water quality. Also, you might go to a developing country. There is a lot of opportunities to make a lot of money over there and increase the GDP. But this comes at the expense of education. If you would like to study over there, or if you have kids and they would like to study over there, will they find the best schools in the world? Will they get the best teachers in the world? No. The same for healthcare. We might have a higher GDP, but they don't provide a better healthcare services. Also, this comes at the expense of crime rate. Some countries they have high GDP, but crime rate is very high. When you walk on the street, any person can hijack you. Also, it comes at the expense of congestion time, which means you get stuck in traffic. Therefore, yes, they produce a lot, but at the same time, this results in people get stuck in traffic, and this results in higher congestion time. Another drawback for GDP is informal economy. What do you mean by informal economy? We can call it underground economy, which means when people work for cash and they don't report it. So they don't pay taxes, and at the same time, it's not included in the GDP. Let's get an example here. Let's assume that you have an economics tutor. This economics tutor, the university pays him or her $100 per hour. So it's reported, he or she pays taxes, therefore it's included in GDP. Let's assume that we have another private tutor, and this private tutor provide the same service with the same quality, and you wanted to get a private lesson with this private tutor, and you will pay $100 per hour. But for this private tutor, he's not going to report it to the government. He will take this cash and he will not pay taxes on this amount of money. Therefore, would it be reflected in the GDP? No, it will not be included in GDP. Why? Because it's not reported. Therefore, you'll discover that in all countries, we have a small percentage in developed countries that represents the informal economy, the underground economy, the people who work on cash and they don't report it. But this percentage increases in developing countries. Therefore, if any one of you goes to a developing country, and before you go, you look at the statistics and you look at the GDP, you'll discover that the GDP is very low. But once you go and visit these countries, you'll discover that in these countries, they have luxurious places, luxurious cities, luxurious shopping centers, luxurious cars. And then you will wonder, how come your GDP is very small, but you have all these luxurious places and cars? So there have been a study done by the World Bank, and they discovered that in developing countries, the actual GDP is bigger than the reported GDP the GDP that we find in the reports, by 2 or 3 times. Why? Because the majority of the businesses in these developing countries are considered informal economy. It is not reported. Therefore, it's not shown in the GDP. Therefore, for these developing countries, take the reported GDP, multiply it by 2 or 3, and this will tell you what will be the actual GDP. Another drawback for GDP is illegal economy. Do you remember what is the definition of GDP? All goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. So, if we're gonna put the ethical consideration now aside, if we produce anything, it should be included in our GDP. Either it's legal or illegal, because this is the definition of GDP. Therefore, if we produce drugs, it should be included in GDP and all other illegal activities. But some of you will say like, what about ethical consideration? I agree with you. But what about we get an example? Let's talk about marijuana. So, marijuana is an example of drugs, and some countries, such as the Netherlands, marijuana is legal, which means you can go and you buy marijuana. It's legal. Therefore, if it's legal, it means that it will be included in the GDP. Then let's choose another country. One of the big producers of drugs in the world is Afghanistan. But in Afghanistan, drugs is considered illegal. So although they are the biggest producer of drugs, they make a lot of money out of these drugs, but it's not shown in the GDP. It's not included in the GDP. Therefore, I give you an example, and this example is debatable because some countries, they consider marijuana legal, other countries, they consider it illegal. Therefore, the countries that consider it legal, it shows up in their GDP. The countries that doesn't consider marijuana as legal, therefore it wouldn't be shown in their GDP. Another drawback of GDP is the work of house spouse. So let me give you an example. Let's assume that we have here a young lady. This young lady got married and she works, and her annual salary after tax is 50,000. So after marriage, she got a baby, but she would like to keep her job. So she decided that she will hire a registered babysitter, and with this babysitter, she will pay her every year $35,000 in order to take care of the baby. And this is registered babysitter, which means they need to check her records to make sure that this person is trustworthy in order to take care of the baby. And this young lady, in order to go to her job, she needs to pay for transportation and she needs to pay for her morning coffee. So she started to calculate the expenses for public transportation and her morning coffee, and it was a total of $15,000 a year. So she started to think she needs to pay for the babysitter 35,000, for her transportation and morning coffee 15,000. This is equal to her salary of 15,000 after tax. She cannot even afford having a breakfast or lunch outdoors. Therefore, she decided to quit her job and to take care of her own baby. So, in this example, which one will provide a better service for the baby? The babysitter or the mother? Definitely the mother. But for the babysitter, would it be included in the GDP? Yes, because the babysitter provide a service, therefore it's part of the GDP, because GDP refers to all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. But what about if a lady quits her job and takes care of her own baby? Is this included in the GDP? No, it's not included. When you take care of your own family, it's not included. So isn't this ironic? Because you provide exactly the same service, even a better service. So why it's not included? Because here we have a problem with calculation. How are we gonna quantify it? Shall we assume that this lady will get the same 50K? Or shall we assume that this lady should get 35K because a babysitter gets 35K? So, since we have a problem with quantifying this one, it's not included. But if you think about the logic, does this lady provide exactly the same or even a better service? Yes. So, should it be included? Absolutely yes. So, the workforce spouse should be included in the GDP. And another example is if you look at the difference between the Eastern and Western culture. In Western culture, we talk about women empowerment, independence, feminism. If we look at the Eastern culture, they value mainly family. So let's cover that in Eastern culture, such as Japan. Some ladies, they prefer to stay at home and take care of their family. While in the West, in the United States, for example, each lady prefers to be independent and keep her job and hire a babysitter to take care of her baby while she's at work. Therefore, you'll discover that in the West, they have a very high GDP. Why they have a high GDP? Because this lady works, her work is included in the GDP, as well as she pays money to the babysitter. The salary of the babysitter is included in the GDP. But if we look at the East, since a lady takes care of her family and she doesn't work, it's not included in GDP. Therefore, if we'd like to be more accurate, we should add the workforce spouse. Therefore, for Eastern cultures, you'll discover that the GDP should be higher than what's reported. Let's get another drawback, which is volunteer work. So, let me give you an example about volunteer work. Let's assume this is your economics tutor. The university pays him $100 an hour. Therefore, it's included in the GDP. Let's assume that now we will have exactly the same economics tutor. It's the same person. And this person, he said, I would like to give back to the community. I will volunteer 1 hour every month, and any person who has a question or needs mentorship, I will provide this mentorship for free. It will be exactly same content and it will be the same quality. Therefore, for this same economics tutor, will he or she get any payment for being a volunteer? No, they will get $0 per hour. Therefore, it will be included in the GDP or not? No, it will not be included in the GDP. While it should be included. Why? Because this is the same person providing exactly the same service with the same quality. So why it is not included? Because here we have a problem with quantifying. How are we gonna calculate it? So for this economics tutor, if he gives a tutorial, he will get $100 per hour. If he's going to give a lecture, he will get $200 per hour. If he's going to get consultation to firms, he will get $1,000 per hour. Therefore, which number shall we put for his volunteer work? It's hard to be calculated. It's hard to be estimated. Therefore, currently, we eliminate it. But in order to be accurate, this volunteer work should be included in GDP because they provide a good service. Another drawback of GDP is leisure time. For any country, yes, they can produce a lot of goods and services. They can work for long hours, but this will come at the expense of what? Leisure time, their quality of life. So they will have less free time. This will impact negatively their social life, and this will impact their leisure time. Another drawback of GDP is it doesn't take into account the income inequality or income distribution. If a country has a higher GDP, does it mean that this country distribute this GDP equally among its population? Definitely not. Therefore, you discover that very few percentage, they take the majority of the GDP, and a large percentage of the population will get a small percentage of GDP. Therefore, it doesn't reflect income distribution or wealth distribution. And these are the 7 drawbacks of gross domestic product.